blame Hungary for everything that they do to stop the Ukraine's European integration. Now when Hungary is gone, we might need to see that some not that good positions of other countries may resume in the future because of that. And do you think that the council will just select another scapegoat, whether it be D.Phil, whether it be parties that are, let's say, newly elected president already without announcement?
I ask if our chat partner to speak a little bit louder because they can barely hear you. So if it's possible, may you speak a little bit louder?
Am I okay?
If it is okay for you,
Okay, yeah, I can speak up. I wouldn't, I'm always a little bit more of an optimist, but I would say that this is normal. Like when we have had EU enlargements beginning in the 1990s, there have always been particular member state interests that have kind of slowed the process down, that have had to be negotiated and bargained, not just French farmers, right, but a whole variety. And we see that today, for example, with Bulgaria vetoing progress for North Macedonia, with Austria putting conditions related to the Western Balkans. This is the normal process of European integration. So I'm more concerned about a complete block, and that was what we had in.
But I just talk about the parliament. See that this new group of bodies of this
Europe, they're rising in power, and a lot of scientists and researchers there are convinced that the next elections, let's say the same France, they will also supply the dispatchers of Europe the group, and they will make them even stronger after that. Do you think also we should expect some rapid changes or not changes in the next European Parliament elections? And can the patriots of Europe, for example, overtake what currently have categories in Europe?
It's really possible. So I see we're looking at some of the slides that I prepared for today. I do think that this is actually a moment where we have relatively favorable political situation, and it may actually get worse. Right? I mean, particularly concerned about the elections in France and the subsequent elections in Germany. Of course, I mean, the AFD is polling very, very high. So maybe I can just talk about this slide a little bit. One of the things which, we can talk about these different veto players, and they're seeing the slide right over there. Yeah. So we can talk about the different veto players, and we can certainly get incredibly frustrated by the parochial and small-minded kind of demands of different member states at different critical junctures. But I think the big question, and I think here removing Orban is really important, is whether, there is a general consensus of improving European foreign policy and EU-based security and defense competencies based on a kind of solid understanding that defending freedom and liberal democracy is the core EU value without which European integration cannot go forward. And sometimes people think, well, why are you talking about liberal democratic values? This is so esoteric. But the reality is that EU foreign policy tools don't function if they're not grounded in liberal democracy. The best example is enlargement. How are you going to have an EU that has a whole different kind of regime types inside of it, asking candidate states, right, to have a free media, the rule of law, protected civil society? It just doesn't work. So there's kind of been this idea, right, that you also another the kind of problem within the European integration debate has been, well, the EU is not really a military power, right? We're a civic power, we're a normative power. So my colleague Nadia Koval and I argue that this kind of dichotomy of separating military power on the one hand and some civic or economic power on another is like a false dichotomy. And what you need is the EU to adopt military power and security competencies grounded in liberal democracy, and not in short-term political expediency. That's how we got where we are. right? I mean, if the German government hadn't been so keen to, in the very short term, get as much cheap energy as they could get from Putin, we would have a much weaker Russia. So that short term kind of expediency, well, everyone is paying for it in the long term. So pushing the EU to think more in terms of medium and long term, a big challenge.
I see. And what do you think is the role of the United States in all of this process? Because currently we can see that uh, the ambitions of the United States appear to be they want Europe to be divided. They don't want to be a strong Europe. And in this regard, all of this anti-globalist and anti-Brussels narrative, they can be supplied, I believe. And we actually can see that the example that you give us to Budapest right before the elections to show some solidarity with uh, Mr. Orban. But as opposed to that, you can see that the Hungarian propaganda, for example, Orban's propaganda, is focused on Magyar Peter being too much involved in the European stuff in Brussels. And it was not framed the same way. This American support for Orban was not the same way as the European allegiance of Peter Magyar.
Mhm. Like, I think actually, in some way, the American authoritarian turn, and that's what it is. I mean, we have in the United States now a government which is, authoritarian minded, which does not respect the rule of law. I am a state employee in a red state, so let's hope they're not watching. They're threatening to, for example, check my syllabi, record my classes, control what I say in the classroom at one of the top research universities in the United States. So this is how far the climate has changed in, a year and a half. We could talk a lot about domestic politics in the US, but for Europe, I think we're talking about a double crisis, right? The first crisis, the first shock was the full scale invasion. Now, they should have been shocked a lot sooner. I know everyone in the room agrees, but the full scale invasion was a shock. And then another shock, of course, is this authoritarian minded foreign policy on the part of the Trump administration. But we know and we study that over the course of European integration, it's often these shocks that push integration forward. And so, to the extent that we see a critical juncture here for the development of EU security and defense competencies, it's not just the full scale invasion and the Russian threat, it's also the authoritarian turn in the US and the sense of you won't be able to rely on the US. And I think in some ways the Ukrainian government should be mindful that the US is probably unreliable now for pretty much, we may have I'm going to talk a little bit in my slides about this back and forth, but it's probably best to rely more on the neighbors, the European Union, on Germany, on Kingdom, and the United States.
So probably last questions before we proceed to your
Mhm.
slides. You study democratic backsliding. And as far as I understood, there are two different approaches to this process because some researchers keep calling it democratic backsliding and some researchers call it autocratization.
Mm.
Because democratic backsliding is a term that does not suppose an actor behind that. It just highlights the process itself. Like as it's happening on its own. Like there is no autocrat, no leader that pushes this process. And what do you think about it? What is the correct term? Or can we use it interchangeably? Or maybe there are some nuances we don't know about. What is better, autocratization or democratic backsliding?
Well, I think democratic backsliding it's a literature within comparative politics. It's a very big literature now. It's the key word that you search for. And so I think for a lot of scholars, it's about connecting to this general literature. I agree, no passive voice, right? Not there is war in Ukraine and not there is backsliding in Poland, right? You need active voice. So it actually connects to this kind of tension within the literature where a lot of scholars, when they look at democratic erosion, they want to point to these long-term processes, right? Globalization, immigration, the loss of job security, where people feel, resentful political party. And we can talk about those long-term processes, which certainly have shaped European politics and American politics. My work, I'm much more in the active voice, looking at how elites set the agenda, how they speak, and how um, the politics of resentment is extremely powerful. And so they convince people that they haven't gotten what they deserve. And the arguments are very, the Hungarians took what you deserve, or the migrants from Syria, or George Soros somehow has what you deserve. He's always everywhere. That man's so powerful. Even in like rural North Carolina, the MAGA politicians are fighting George Soros. And so this politics of resentment, of course, there are reasons why people feel less secure, especially to do with economic changes in advanced industrialized economy. But much of it is top down. And I think these entrepreneurs of what I call ethnopopulism, they try it all out and they see what works. And unfortunately, they play dirty. Makes it very hard for the pro-democratic parties to oppose them when they're playing so dirty.
Okay, and just a short notice to our participants. Professor Vachudova will have a presentation right now, and then we will have a short Q&A session. So if you have any questions in mind, whether you're offline, online, feel free to take notes and be prepared to ask them when the
Yeah.
time comes.
And any questions, everything is. So let me do this quickly, and I'll just go like this when I'm ready. Yeah. So next slide. Yeah. So this is just the article that Nadia Koval, my colleague, and I wrote together that makes the case for a strong geopolitical European Union based on liberal democratic values. And, it's a medium to long-term kind of article, but worth, I think, thinking about. So this is great because it goes right into your question about what do we call these folks. So I've taken to calling them authoritarian minded. They're not necessarily have achieved their authoritarians. But what do they want on the EU stage? We've already discussed it, right? They want to decouple European integration from the regime type of liberal democracy. This was Orban's fantasy, right? Everyone should be whatever regime they want. All we do is have this economic integration. Oh, and of course, give Hungary lots of money. Economic expediency and this kind of Trojan horse for other authoritarian interests. What I'm looking at in my new project, so this is kind of brand new, is what happens when every election is a regime election. And this comes from this observation that in countries like the Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, the United States is the huge example. We're in the situation now where we have a group of authoritarian-minded parties and a group of, let's call them pro-democratic parties. And when we do have the democratic backsliders or the authoritarian-minded parties in power, yes, it's possible to get them out, like we just saw in Hungary, as happened in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia in the past, in North Macedonia in the distant past. But they seem to come back again. And they seem to come back again for a number of reasons that I'm looking at in this project. So go ahead. But before we talk about why they come back, I just want to, because we're building new kind of concepts here, I want to take a moment and talk about populism. This is one of my academic kind of conceptual priorities, let's put it that way. I want you all to think about that populism is not the same as authoritarianism, as far-right politics, as any of those bad things. Populism is just an appeal to people saying, please vote for me. I'm going to legislate on behalf of the regular people and not on behalf of the elite, the top 1%, etc. And so I would actually always want to vote for a politician that was at least a little bit populist, not being part of the 1% or not, the question then becomes, and go ahead and move forward, how do they define who are the people and who are the enemies of the people? So when you meet a populist politician, which is most of them, before you decide that populism is bad, like ask yourself, who are the people they're trying to represent and who are the enemies of the people? So populists on the left, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Syriza, Podemos, they're about the economic, it's an economic argument, right? That the top 1% are the big financial institutions, the banks, the ultra wealthy, and they're going to govern on behalf of all the rest of us. Whereas the variety of populism that's associated with democratic backsliding is what I call ethnopopulism. And here the politicians are saying, I'm going to, the enemies of the people are culturally harmful domestic groups. Women really have a starring role, actually, feminist women. I don't know if you've ever thought about Orban's domestic politics, which was extremely anti-women, LGBTQ community, some minorities, and then an external kind of cast of characters, the European Union, other international institutions, liberal professors, that kind of thing. And what's interesting about it is that in this ethnopopulism, you have the justification for democratic backsliding, because what they're essentially saying is that the people, defined however they define the people, are under so much threat from feminists or transnational liberals that they have to concentrate power. And this justifies the concentration of power in order to repel this threat. And so this is one of the things that we've seen is calling the opposition parties enemies of the people. Now, I hope that never happens here in Ukraine, where you have an incumbent political party in power and describing the opposition political parties in the Rada as terrorists and enemies of the people, because this is where liberal democracy breaks down. In order to have a functioning liberal democracy, the opposition has to be, you can disagree with them in terms of every policy in the world, but there needs to be respect for the opposition, for its existence. And once you're saying that opposition parties are enemies of the people, terrorists and threats to security, clearly you left democracy. One of the debates is whether speech can be part of backsliding, and I think it absolutely can. Okay, let's go forward. Okay, you did that. Yep. I think we're done with that one. Forward. Okay. And so then what is democratic backsliding? You all know this. Diminish independent institutions, eliminate checks and balances, destroy the norms of public life. If you look at what's happening in Washington, D.C. today, the destruction of the norms of public life, like norms we didn't even know we had, where you're like, oh, we had them, and now they're gone. And also kind of as I said, the end of the respected opposition and a sense of shared national interest. Now the goals: amplify power, concentrate power, and most important, prevent political turnover. It's amazing how long Orban managed to stay in power. And actually with every election, it seemed harder and harder that he would more difficult to dislodge him, because he was working so hard to prevent the turnover. But managed they did, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. Go ahead. This is just the target of authoritarian-minded incumbents, and I never thought I would be putting this list up and talking about my own country, the United States. Originally, this list was for Hungary, way back when Orban was a trailblazer. And so we talk about the playbook that has been used over and over again now. So in all of these cases, and this is kind of the heart of my argument and my puzzle, because I don't have the answers, you know, they do eventually lose power. So they lost power in North Macedonia, in Slovakia, in Czech Republic, in Poland, in Hungary, in the United States. Now they're back. In the United Kingdom, arguably, the outgoing Tory party was certainly concentrating power and destroying norms of public life. Boris Johnson may have been a friend of Ukraine, but he was not a friend of liberal democratic values inside of the United Kingdom. And so people mobilize. They mobilize against the authoritarians. Opposition parties, often very fragmented, like, oh, Serbia. I mean, my Serbian friends. But the opposition is all these little parties. Disaster. The Hungarian opposition for so many years was fragmented and small and couldn't work together. Then TISA came along, which that was the miracle, right? To be able to unite the opposition. You have civil society that mobilizes, and of course, citizens that participate much, much more. This is just an article that we did asking people in democratic backsliding countries, like, why were they mobilizing? Go ahead. And one of the things we found out is that many of them in Poland and the Czech Republic just said, we just need to get rid of this government and everything will be okay. Whereas in Bulgaria and Romania, our protesters very wisely said, it's not just about this one government. We need like systemic change. That our institutions haven't developed properly since 1989. We also found that they were very keen on raising public awareness among other citizens. So they knew that protesting wasn't going to change government policy, but they were very keen to improve, kind of show other citizens that they needed to get out onto the street. Okay, I better keep going. Yeah. So opposition parties in this situation, they run on saving democracy. Now this is already difficult because parties are supposed to run on policy issues. Vote for me and I'll tax more, or we'll use the tax money to improve the schools or healthcare or infrastructure, or policy issues related to migration or other things. But when you get to an election where it's just about vote for us or it'll be the end of democracy, this really isn't a great appeal to voters. It was great in 1989 when, my people, the Czechoslovaks, went and voted against communism and for democracy. But coming back to these kinds of elections now, where instead of arguing about policy, we're just saying vote for us because we will destroy the Constitution and will uphold liberal democracy. It's especially terrible if you're doing it over and over. Okay, second thing that happens, civil society mobilize. It's beautiful. Has any of you seen the great protests in Prague just these last? And these are my people. I love them. I love M.Phil. But you know what I'm really upset about? Like on a scholarly level, but also on a personal level. Like, where were these protesters before the election? Like, they knew that the ethnopopulist parties were going to win, but nobody protested. And that's the problem with civic mobilization. Everyone loves to protest against the sitting government. Maybe even here. But does anybody come out and mobilize? And that makes a lot of things make it very difficult for these pro-democratic coalitions to succeed election after election. So first, you have to undo democratic backslide. We see in Poland today how challenging that is. We see how the Biden administration didn't really make much progress in that. And you also have a usually really bad government. Like, look at Orban's Hungary. You know, TISA is inheriting a country where the economy is in shambles. Now, you know, Romania now outperforms Hungary. If you've been around since the early 90s, like me, studying this is quite a change of fortune for those two countries. Actually, this economic immiseration of Hungary really helped TISA, right? TISA voters weren't just voting against Moscow and for Brussels. They were also voting because their economic situation had got much worse because of poor governance and huge, colossal corruption. The problem is that when these pro-democratic parties come in, and I think we could make an analogy here for whatever government takes over after the war here in Ukraine, everyone is disappointed. Like, that government cannot please anyone because it inherits such a difficult situation. It's usually a coalition of different interests. And on top of that, the people who most mobilized, maybe people like you, are the most disappointed because that government maybe cannot deliver, say, on the environment. Many young people in America mobilized on environmental issues and then were incredibly disappointed with the Biden administration. I was incredibly disappointed with the Biden administration when it comes to foreign policy and support for Ukraine. I was out there, though, trying to keep the Democrats in power. And so this kind of creates the seeds of its own destruction. If you go to the United Kingdom today, it will be very difficult to find a single person who will say positive things about the current Starmer government, even though that government is trying to repair enormous damage done by the previous Tory government. Okay, it's done. Yes, voters. And finally, voters, let's send there. You know, voters apparently don't remember very much about what happened 4 years ago, 6 years ago, 8 years ago. And they're very susceptible to ethnopopulist promises. And you know how it works? Ethnopopulist migrants who have brown skin to feminist women who are going to be mean to the LGBT community, where all these issues, right? And then they make some big economic promises about how they're going to help people like you. They don't deliver on those economic promises at all. In fact, every one of these ethnopopulist parties, except Law and Justice in Poland, has been a gift to the mega billionaires. But they do deliver on those cultural issues, and they can deliver fast. You know, you can start putting refugees in detention centers and putting lots of hate towards the LGBT community out there. You can do those very quickly at no cost. And so they have this impression that they're delivering, but they're only delivering on the cultural side. Okay, anywhere? Yeah. This is one of my favorite protesters, and because I'm Czech, I am particularly fond of him. He's out there protesting in 2019, saying things are so bad that even the Czechs have started to pray. A very secular nation, and something about Jan Hus and Iron Man. Went with the times. Okay, and then the last thing I want to tell you about is if you're interested in political parties and how they're changing their positions and how their positions are becoming more and more, how competition is becoming more and more on the cultural axis and very little on the economic axis. We have the Chapel Hill Expert Survey. You can go online and you can find your countries on the Chess Interactive, and you can say, I want to look at the Italian political parties and I want to see their positions on the environment and on support for Ukraine. And you can make a graph. And it's very easy and very interesting. We just had a whole new round of data for 2024. And this fall, we are going to be launching in Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and we're going to repeat our Western Balkan survey. I'm not sure how good our data will be on the positions of Ukrainian political parties right now, but that's okay. We start now, and then as parties develop and change and things, we'll have the data will improve. And just one more slide. This just gives you an example of the kind of thing you can do. So these are just Hungarian and Polish parties. And you can see their positions here on anti-establishment and migration, and also on the European Union. And you can see, for example, in Hungary, how Fidesz is on one place and the opposition parties in quite a different place. Okay, we can stop there. Maybe go forward one more and just leave Poland up there. Friendly neighbor. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this presentation. I believe it was really fruitful and interesting to listen to. To continue this discussion, I've made some rules spoke, and we mentioned that mostly all of the politicians are populists. And actually, a former consul of Hungary, Kiev, once told me that the last Hungarian elections was a battle between two populists. Populist and between Viktor Orban, and according to you, Viktor Orban can of course be considered an ethno-populist because of what he was doing during his 16 years in power with the instrumentalization of Russia propaganda, with finding another enemy every time. It was George Soros, it was migrants, it was war, Russian-Ukrainian, yes, Ukrainians, Ursula von der Leyen, and all of that stuff. But can we say that this high level of political mobilization in Hungary, that so many young people, they came to electoral districts and voted, they guaranteed the defeat of Orban? Because as we can see, Orban was defeated not by populist party, but majoritarian part, even though Orban did everything possible to gerrymander this, yes, majoritarian parts in such a way so that the rural population always prevails over the city or urban population. So do you think that we can witness something like that in our neighboring countries, for example, in Poland in the next year or so? Romania?
Well, I think your first point, I think TISA is populist, but it just proves my point about varieties of populism, right? It's a centrist populist party with some positions we would put on, as center right or conservative. I think what was so dynamic about TISA was that this was a party, and Magyar Peter in particular, willing to go to 5, 6, 7 rallies in one day in all the small towns of Hungary. So, and he put a lot of emotion into his campaigning. So one of the things we've talked about is how the pro-democratic parties don't have much of a chance if they don't also find their own sources of how to make voters feel an emotional attachment towards it. I think what happened in Hungary has already happened in Poland and the Czech Republic, in terms of the mobilization that defeated Law and Justice and the mobilization that defeated Babiš previously. I think the problem is the repeated mobilization, like repeatedly asking people to mobilize, to vote, to organize in defense of liberal democracy. Because voters, of course, many will mobilize in defense of liberal democracies, but the issues that they really care about in their daily life have to do with, the family budget and schools and education and healthcare. And so we are degrading our democracy. And then, of course, we have to contend with the damage if it becomes a back and forth. Now, my hope for Hungary is that Orban's rule was so long and so intractable, but also so destructive and so economically destructive for the average Hungarian, that we have a chance of not getting into a yo-yo situation But in the TISA government, how is the center or how is the left really represented? So I'll be very interested to see how our experts kind of put TISA on these issues, because one of the things we see. So okay, follow me with this. A lot of these ethnopopulist parties, they have very conservative or far right positions on cultural issues, but they also have left-wing positions on the economy, and that makes them hard to defeat. Our experts have never put Fidesz on the right. They've always put it on the left when it comes to economic policy. And then you get this term called welfare chauvinism. In France, the National Rally, they say, not no welfare state, not, American style market economy. They say big French welfare state, but only for the real French. So they're solidly kind of on the left in terms of redistribution, but in this very chauvinist way.
Yes, but this overall is perceived as an umbrella party, like as an ad hoc force, and hopefully we'll see more democratic parties in the upcoming near elections in 4 years' time, because many people in Hungary, they voted not for TISA but against Fidesz, and this is just a step one forward, just to stop this democratic backsliding process, have a look at where they are and decide what they're going to do next. And I hope that in 4 years' time we will see not just DK and Micha Zanka, but other parties that will be interested in having a really good development of Hungary in terms of democracy.
Yes, but I worry about that, right? Because once you have a set of parties and Fidesz remains a large party, it helps Fidesz come back potentially. So
yes, and we actually witnessed that in Slovakia.
Yes.
Robert Fico was defeated, but he came.
Here's a fun fact. You remember about I remember Vladimir Mečiar, who took Slovakia out of contention for EU and NATO and had 4 years of very solid democratic backsliding. He was elected in 1994. But the only reason he won is because two center liberal parties, probably started by political science professors, those are always the worst, they refused to merge because these egotistical men refused to be in, they each wanted their own party. And that happens very often in this, particularly the center right, that you have this fragmentation, these little parties around one personality, and then they don't make it past the 5% and helps pave the way. So I'm a fan for robust party competition. I'm not a fan for these micro parties that revolve around the personality of one person.
Yes, I guess in Hungary gerrymandering kills small party competition. But Micha Zanka managed to go through. Okay, thank you very much. I guess we can proceed to the Q&A session. Please.
Thank you. My name is Nathan. I want to say that I like the presentation and the speech. I think they're a blessing for me because I'm currently preparing for a master thesis. And I have two questions that somewhat attach to your work and how I personally going to be writing it. The first question is about the political position. I'm writing about Bulgaria, and one of the things that always troubles me when writing about political position, how to better research it, because this specific topic is, the best way is to do it mathematically, but at the same time mathematically hard. Some of the scientists offer to send the letters to the politicians and ask them specific questions, which is impossible because they never answer. The others recommend to speak with the experts and do like qualitative research, but at the same time, it's really hard to put qualitative research on something empiristic, So, how would you recommend? That's the first question, to research your political position.
Well, I think I'm going to use the Chapel Hill Expert Survey. So there is a really interesting debate about this, and we tend to, the alternative source of quantifiable data is from the Manifesto Project. And so parties publish manifestos, and they have a great data set on every manifesto of every party. The challenge, I think, with manifesto, although I think all of it, all sources of data are valid and great, and we use them together. The problem with manifestos is parties write them knowing no one is going to read them. Maybe they know the researcher will read them. So we in the Chapel Expert Survey, we ask experts. So we have a list of 50 to 60 experts for every country. It changes over the years. When we first started, I was sending these surveys by mail, and I think our list included opera singers and ambassadors. Today, it's all political scientists, people like you who study political science and who understand political parties. But we only ask our experts to fill out the survey for the country that they know best. And we ask them to take into account everything, not just what the party kind of does in parliament, but also what they say when they're campaigning. And we ask them how divided the party is on certain issues, so that we capture if there's a lot of heterogeneity in positions within a party, we can also see that. So I think our data is as good as it gets. But for third, for sure, I recommend always going and doing interviews. I think that a researcher one of the reasons to do interviews is because you will get ideas and angles that you never thought before, right? Like you may not be able to quantify your interview notes in any way, but you may think of a whole new angle, or someone might explain something to you in a whole different way. And I also think at the end of the day, like speaking to people is just incredibly important for your kind of sense of that subject. So in my case, I studied 15 different post-communist countries, but I wasn't studying Ukraine. And when the full-scale invasion started, my whole focus had shifted that fall already because I could see it coming on Ukraine. And so I started coming here. Like I wouldn't be able to sit in Brussels or London or Chapel Hill and write about Ukraine without spending time here. Even if I had the most beautiful data. Doesn't stop my colleagues, of course.
How many would you recommend should you do?
Oh, well, I love interviewing people. I mean, there's an interview and then there's coffee, right? So, or a drink. So I would recommend 20 people. But I also recommend not trying to just interview party leaders. Interview students who are in the student section, or interview scholars who study politics in that country. Mm-hmm.
The second question for me.
Let's just switch and we will get back to
Yeah.
you. If we have any questions from our online audience, please raise your hands if there are any questions. No? Okay. Then you,
Actually, we have one.
okay.
Okay, Maria, you have your phone.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Nice. So on one of your slides, there was mentioned that voters motivated by economic concerns and apparently forget that authoritarian parties cause problems. Perhaps it's a very simple question, but like, what stops voters from falling for this ethnic scapegoating and big economic promises again and again?
That's a good question, and I wish I knew the answer. I would be a top strategist. I think one of the things, though, that has changed is the information environment. And the information environment that voters are plunged into now is often controlled by ethnopopulist parties, right? And you see, like today in the Czech Republic, Babiš is trying to take over Czech television. In the United States, Stephen Colbert is off the air. The pressure against media is very high. So part of I don't want to say genius, but part of the effective strategy of these ethnopopulists is to create these information environments online and in traditional media where no one remembers all the terrible things that happened. and no one talks about it. And there's just this constant kind of disinformation about everything that they will deliver. One of the ways to counteract that, though, I think, is to try to be more local. So looking at TISA, for example, the fact that even though it was a very kind of small operation of an umbrella party, the fact that it managed, and Magyar himself managed to spend so much time in small towns, is something that, so that the voters have a chance to actually speak to these opposition politicians and not just hear that they are the enemies of the people.
Yeah, I guess that was
Thank
one
you.
of the
Thank you.
I guess that was one of the crucial points of his pre-election campaign, that he has this tour around Hungary,
Absolutely.
that everyone had an opportunity to come visit, see Magyar with their own eyes and ask some questions, not seeing him from like big words, nem-fizetünk or something like that.
Well, and it was, of course, completely compulsory because he had absolutely no time on television. I mean, they gave zero time to the opposition parties.
He did have time on television, but he wasn't present during that moment. And then people wondered, why would he want to close this MTI channel that basically spreads propaganda against him. All right, so let's take one question from the audience. I saw there was this.
Yeah, thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. And I just wanted to ask about the United States because I'm going this fall for my master's degree
Oh,
in the
congratulations.
US. So
Where are you going?
I'm going to Pennsylvania. It's near Philadelphia, Villanova University, maybe if you have heard. And I was concentrated on the Middle East when I was studying for my bachelor, but I want to a little bit shift my specialization and focus more on American studies and on the United States. So during my master's, so I have a question: what is your forecast in regards of the United States being able to recover from this democratic backsliding? How soon they will be able to do it after Trump? Like whether you're more optimistic or pessimistic about this. So it's more like domestically I'm asking, and about the United States as an international actor. Will the situation after Trump will change drastically, or maybe some process can be irreversible? So a lot of experts are afraid that they can be.
Mhm. Great question. So I'll start by saying, from everything all the data that we have right now, the approval ratings of Trump now are in the 30s. So historically, this would mean a huge landslide victory for the Democrats in November. So the House will shift to Democrat, and it looks now possible that the Senate will as well. This will fundamentally change the kind of feeling in the United States. Like the executive is extremely powerful, but with now some checks and balances coming from a Democratic run Congress, I would expect that Trump will be impeached again for, so many. In terms of recovery, though, I think I'm very concerned about that because, as I said in my presentation, like when Trump administration finally goes, repairing the damage to the norms of public life, to independent media, and also I was not expecting that the American businesses would take advantage of Trump to this extent to consolidate power. So how do you fight against a media mogul that owns Paramount and CBS and everything? You can't break it up easily. So just like in Hungary, we'll have just very entrenched powers. I have to say with regret that you, as an international student, will not be able to speak out in any way about American politics or post about it because your social media will be potentially looked at when you go in and out of the country. And even something like a master's thesis that would be published ordinarily on the university's website could potentially be discovered. So isn't that terrible? Like, I can't believe I have to say that. So when I was teaching my graduate course this spring, we had students from Venezuela, from Turkey, from Russia, Ukraine, all these Brazil and Western Europe as well. And for a little while, my university had a policy that if students complained that you weren't teaching the right thing, they could turn the camera on and watch you. Then we had a big uproar and they turned it off. But as the daughter of, dissidents to communist rule in Czechoslovakia, this is just crazy. So we were concerned. We were also talking to the camera. Like, we don't really mean that. Just as a joke, but it's not a joke. Your second question, in terms of foreign policy, we had one Trump administration, and I was really fascinated how much, for example, the Germans would often argue that we're never going back to America pre-Trump one. And I thought, but we have, right? We got rid of Trump, and now we have much more kind of standard American foreign policy with all of its positives and negatives. But maybe, my German students were right, actually, the first time. I don't see in the United States going back to the same level of commitment to European security. These things have now become politicized at home, and the scale of problems that we face in the United States in terms of healthcare, education, just poverty is rising. We have my political science department, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We're number 13 in the country, which is great. There's Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and there's us. We have a food bank in our department now for our graduate students. So I think all of these things mean that we will not be back in the same way.
Yeah, unfortunately. But thank you for your answer.
All right, let's just do it the same way, going on this side and then this side.
Okay, let's start here because
That was the second row.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It was an honor to listen to your ideas and have this expertise from your actual research. I actually have a question regarding Ukraine and your perspective on Ukraine, because right now, when we're in this period of having no elections, we are already thinking about what will happen when we have the next elections. Some opportunity will be given to us to do this. And I wonder, you mentioned these micro parties, personalistic style of given your expertise, your experience, research in post-communist countries and the political party systems, do you see any, do you have maybe any recommendations? Do you see any way that Ukraine can have a more institutionalized political party system? Because right now, from all of our elections, the parties that we have here, they created, they take part in like one election or something, and then they disappear, and the cycle repeats itself. I would say that it seems that the data is so bad. We have like no notions of these political cultures in our country. So I wonder whether you have any thoughts about this.
I have a lot of thoughts. I'll start with the caveat that political scientists are terrible about predicting the future or giving any advice. So I'll also say that being here, in some ways, everyone's on the same team. And that's not true in either of my countries. So I hope that Ukrainians will manage to preserve a sense of common national interest, right? Like in the 90s, if you looked at the post-communist countries that went the quickest, they had market capitalism and liberal democracy kind of marching together, and they had a shared sense of national interest across the political parties, more or less. Poland didn't have a far-right party in its parliament until 1997. I worked for Václav Havel in Prague, and he was always regretful that there was as much infighting as there was, but always tried to push for a common Czech national interest. I hope that the war will be a shock to Ukrainian politics and help create more what we call programmatic parties. But I have already identified a problem. So let's try this. We did this at KSE. How many of you here are in a political party or feel warmly towards a political party, like identify with a political party? You're not on camera, so dare to raise your hand. Anyone? See, this is the problem. Okay, in the United States, oh, God knows we're having our problems now. But my students, many of them are in the Young Democrat Club, the Young Republican Club. You have to love your political parties. You have to have, okay, not love all of them, but you need to join them and shape them and influence them. And I spent 5 years teaching in Belgrade. There are so many differences between Ukraine and Serbia, but this you have in common. My students there all associated political parties with corruption. Of course, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go work for an NGO or in a think tank and then human rights and so beautiful.
Yes.
Sorry, Frank. I love some of my former students are running like the opposition in Serbia, and I love them very much. But you know what? None of those organizations govern. It's political parties. Political parties are elected, political parties govern. And so if you care about the future of Ukraine, you should join them. And if you don't like the way they are, change them from the inside. If 50 young people joined one of these personal parties and just, kick the person to the curb and take it over. But that's the only way. If you leave political parties to those people because parties are corrupt and you're not corrupt and you're just going to leave them to the corrupt people, it won't work. So how many of you are inspired to join a political party? That would be my real contribution to Ukraine's future.
Any party or party that already exists?
Look, I don't know my Ukrainian parties, but I do know you can take over. I mean, that's what the ethnopopulists do, right? Think about it. The Tories were a big tent conservative political party. I hated Maggie Thatcher, but I respected it doesn't matter what I thought about Maggie Thatcher, but like this was a respected conservative party with a big variety of had a variety of positions, for example, on European integration and on other issues. Under, Boris Johnson and friends, all of those people were thrown out, and it became a much more extreme and much more unified party. Same with the Republicans in the United States. Any Republican that has shown any opposition to the MAGA has been removed. Most recently, last Tuesday, Thomas Massie. So we need to do the opposite of that, right? Go into these parties and take them over and spread them out and make them more programmatic, bigger tents.
All right. There is a gentleman.
Yeah. Okay, so about the strategy to fight democratic backsliders, I actually thought of populist forces like kind of a sugar, some sweets, some high dopamine the people right now. I mean, their rhetoric is sweet. So maybe the strategy to fight them is to become those anti-heroes, to become good guys in bad disguise. So they can fight for the voters using this power of populists, like maybe even using strategies like witch hunting, etc., etc. So not to be boring to people, but to be a document people need, and like replace the bad populists with us maybe. And with the difference of keeping the democracy in mind, is it possible, or is this strategies or they corrupt, and people that use them become those bad populists we fight it for?
This is a great question, and we're having this debate in the United States right now. Like, what do we think about California redrawing its districts, gerrymandering, right, in response to huge gerrymandering? In my state, North Carolina, 55% of the population voted for a Democratic governor, but we have virtually no Democratic representation in the Congress because of gerrymandering. Huge. So you play their kind of use their tactics. I would say in terms of campaigning, right? I think it's essential to have emotion, to have a kind of a message that really connects to a large cross section of voters. See, it's interesting because we've often had ethnopopulist and kind of very simplified and loud campaigns, followed by democratic backsliding. But could we have a kind of more centrist, loud, populist campaign, not followed by democratic backsliding? That would be better, certainly, than the opposite. The worry, though, and maybe it's too late, right, is that like the norms of public life will then be eroded even more. You know, I often like to refer my American students to Mitt Romney, and when Mitt Romney campaigned against Barack Obama, they had a lot of very deep respected each other, valued each other. This was like our last normal campaign. But today, perhaps neither of them could be elected. I don't know.
All right. Are there any online questions? If not, we will proceed with you. Okay, keeping up. So I'm very interested in. Thank you for your presentation. I'm very glad that I managed to to be not in time, but to be present here. So I'm really interested in the example you brought up about blocking the cities because of some political events and disagreement. Yes, in America, in US, yes. You said that.
Blocking what?
Thesis in your final work, if it's not. Yeah. Probably you can give some examples of such situation because it's really shocking for me personal. And second is my personal concern, and probably you can say something on your behalf. What do you think about that? Don't you think that impeachment, yes, of Donald Trump can cause more troubles because of J.D. Vance as his successor? Because it's what I'm really yes afraid of a little bit. And I know that if I'm not mistaken, after that the U.S. Congress should give him his new vice president, but I don't know whether they will also remove J.D. Vance. So for me, it's a really great concern, honestly. Because
So let me answer your first question. You know, it's not that there is a policy of telling students what they can or can't write about. You know, American universities remain an incredibly vibrant, wonderful place to study. But there are gradations of control of MAGA Republicans over universities. So that's one side. I'm in North Carolina. So in the South, we have very strong MAGA control right now. There's Florida, Texas. So there you will have self-censorship, no question. Professors, students. I mean, I would, you know, there are things I want to fight for in my life. Ukraine's security and freedom, for example. Don't really want to go down like on that hill, if you know what I mean. It's not worth it. The second part, though, so there's some places with clear just the immigration, right? Like when you're coming in and out on a student visa, they have the right to look through your social media and
They do this.
They do
They
this.
actually do this, yeah, and they can reject if you have on your LinkedIn, because I got a visa, but like when I came, I was rejected firstly, and I was really scared why. And then they told they do it for every Ukrainian student. I don't know why, maybe because students like started revolutions or something. And then like 3 days they've been checking my social media. I deleted everything, of course, but I didn't write anything about Trump, but I thought maybe I wrote about Middle East and Iran and stuff, and I deleted everything, and they proved Fortunately, yeah, but I was scared.
This is heartbreaking. This is really heartbreaking. I mean, I'm sorry. I really, as an American and a strong American patriot, I'm very, very sorry. So you see the problem, and the problem is that also, you start your study and you come home to see your family, and then you can't get back. So we have had happen to us, those students. We don't always know exactly what they saw on the World Wide Web that made them reject the entries. So for international students in the United States right now, it's very clear. You remove your social media footprint and you stay away off the radar. But I am hopeful very much that it's temporary. Of course, the greatest cost is being borne by the United States. I mean, we have a big decrease in the number of foreign students, and I assume in some ways the quality of our foreign students. And America has thrived because of so many amazing people coming to, including my family. I go out there on the protests and I have this big sign that says immigrants are America.
All right. About trade events.
Sorry.
Okay.
I just have a quick
I'm really
answer. Quick answer. In order for Trump to actually be impeached, right? So they can impeach him, they can start this big process. But in order to actually impeach him, so the big process will take months, long time, and then in the Senate it has to be, I think, 60 votes. Is it 60, 65? And that is probably not possible. So you see, it won't actually come through. But the process will change the dynamic of as will just accountability, right? All of the committees in Congress will shift to a Democratic chair, and then this will start. It won't be particularly productive, but it will be different than what we have.
So it's more like a check and balance system rather than real removal of Trump. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it will actually happen.
Okay.
Now, other forces may remove him.
All right.
We should start end on something more optimistic. Does anyone have like a question that I can answer in a more optimistic?
Yeah. I don't know. Okay. Thank you very much for this lecture. And as I told you before, I want to write my master thesis about populism. And I have a question. Can we consider that nativism rhetoric, us against them, is a part of ethnopopulism, or we need to separate these two concepts when we talk about right-wing party with populism narratives, with populism rhetoric?
This is a great question. So why say ethnopopulism? It's sort of a new term. And the main reason is because what these political parties, the way they're appealing to voters, is not ethnic nationalism. So this was the old way. This was the way, in the 90s when I was doing my research in 2000s. You go to Bratislava and it's all about hating the Hungarians, and you go to Romania and it's all about hating the Hungarians, and you go to Prague and it's all about hating themselves or Roma, I don't know. But this ethnic nationalism was always aimed at neighboring nations and intermingled minorities. But today, ethnopopulists have the enemies are not each other anymore, right? Orban was very keen to try to create this, far right. The enemies are now shared enemies, and this is dangerous. So it's a kind of nativism, but it's a different kind of nativism that's not aimed so much at historical enemies or at all. It's aimed at these groups that are designated as culturally harmful. So Orban can agree with, Fico, that the LGBT community, feminists like you, that von der Leyen, the EU institutions, George Soros, that these are the enemies. So they have a common set of enemies. there was a great cartoon in Bratislava, this like Slovak neo-Nazis like lying at the psychologist's office. And he's like, oh, I'm having such a breakdown these days because I'm having so many warm thoughts about Hungarians. So now I'm all on the same team. Nativism, when we look at these concepts too, we often need to look at the positive side. So we might call it patriotism, right? Or we might think of it in terms of national interest. And one thing I really hope for Ukraine is that you stay on this path of a very inclusive sense of who are the people. Because what the ethnopopulists do is they have a very exclusive sense of who are the people, who are the real Hungarians or the real French. And they push out minorities, whether, ethnic minorities or LGBTQ minorities or others. They push out immigrants and refugees. They push out women who are not the right women. So a very exclusive view of who are the people. But for success, I think, in Ukraine after the war, like a very inclusive view. So yes to populism in Ukraine after the war, but a populism with an inclusive view of who are the people that we're fighting for, including, all the minorities and all the people speaking different languages, as long as, they identify with a civic sense of nationalism with Ukraine.
Yeah, we have questions from our online audience. So, Anastasia, please.
Good evening. My name is Anastasia Fibura, and first of all, thank you very much for your lecture. And my question will concern the radical parties, as you have mentioned in your lecture. So we could see the popularity of radical parties in EU have increased, and let's take Poland, for example, the right-wing party of Grzegorz Braun and his party, the Confederation of the Poland. Its support recently increased much more in polls, and even concerning the ruling party Civic Coalition. Of course, the ruling party has a majority now, but does this trend suggest that more voters are looking for alternatives to liberal parties, even if some of these alternatives may be less liberal or more authoritarian? And what should liberal parties do to regain and strengthen their electorate's trust?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question. I missed my moment just to end on a positive note. I think, look, you mentioned Confederacja specifically. To me, Confederacja is very similar to other kind of extreme right, actually white supremacist parties. The Czech Republic has multiple ones, right? We have the SPD, we have the three colors. Motorista, whatever they are, the motorists. More than half of Czech voters voted for parties that I would consider in some way white supremacist parties. But Confederacja is one of those parties that is, I have limited knowledge, but from what I see, my son is about to be working in Warsaw, so I will have an inside view. It is a party that can become more popular based on what the neighbors say or do. And so, for example, Mečiar in Slovakia would have never won. Well, we already talked about it. But another reason he won is because Budapest kept saying these things about how all Hungarian, greater Hungary, and kept criticizing how Hungarians are being treated in Slovakia, and really got into Slovak politics, which of course made people vote for the ethnic nationalist party of the time. So I think one of the things about Confederacja is to not give it any fuel, and Ukraine has a role to play in that. And I'm not sure that recent decisions about the naming of this unit I have no idea why you would do that, but it will make parties like this more popular. I think neighboring countries, this can still, these historical grievances have been ripping our Central European countries apart. With my students, we often look at after World War I, when you have new Czechoslovakia, new Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria in this space, sandwiched between a tired but still very belligerent Soviet Union and then a Germany that was, and instead of preparing to face these existential security threats, they spent the 1920s fighting with each other, the Czechs and the Poles over Chechnya, etc. In history is about by a man named Joseph Rothschild, and he has a beautiful chapter about this, all the little ways that our countries were just at each other. So my hope is that we have a little silver lining with the of a common, extremely terrible Russian enemy that helps some of these small things melt away.
We'll see.
We'll see.
I guess.
Thank you for your question.
No.
Oh, and look up Confederacja in the Chapel Hill Expert Survey because we have really interesting data on their other positions, right? Like, what are their positions on the environment and so forth? So if you're particularly interested, go look deep into that.
Okay, let's
Okay.
take another question from online.
Yeah, Narazi.
And then we'll have two questions from the Google form. Let's see if everyone.
I'm sorry, the person wants to ask questions, so
Okay.
Nora, you have the floor. Nora,
Thank you
please.
very much. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Great. First of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and thank you to Ukrainian Prism for organizing this event. My name is Nora. I'm from Georgia, and nowadays I'm in Poland, studying Russian propaganda. So, my question is about when we talk about democratic backsliding, we are always mentioning the far right parties, right? And that's for a good reason. But what do you think about the far left extreme part of the spectrum? I want to articulate this well. So what I have seen as studying Russian propaganda, I feel like somehow they monopolized both sides of the political spectrum. On the right, these traditional values and Christianity side, and on the left, this anti-imperial rhetoric, how the West is to blame in everything. And how do you think, is that a threat in the future? For example, the part of the Democratic Party that AOC and Zoran Mamdani represent. AOC in the beginning of the war even had a bit disturbing attitude towards helping Ukraine, I might say. But later it has developed, of course, and now she's not saying this anymore. But far left parties are also hesitant towards helping Ukraine. And they blame the West and particularly United States so much. Some of them they can even justify, for example, brainwashing Uyghurs in China and even Iran's regime. To my, I'm very sorry, but there are some people who identify with Democratic Party on the far left. It's mainly online on YouTube that have this kind of attitudes. And I just wonder, what do you think about it?
Yeah, so the genesis, particularly in the United States, comes from a very critical reading of American foreign policy in the world, going back, to the Cold War, to American foreign policy, particularly in Latin America. I have had many students who have, as very young people, taken this very critical approach to American foreign policy and somehow translated it, probably with the help of the online environment, into a conviction that, since the United States is the worst, somehow Moscow must be less bad, right? And this is we all agree, I think, in this room, extremely wrong. But it's a kind of simplistic, it's a simple truth, right, for them. They often comes from a not full understanding of history and geopolitics. There's also the far left sort of feminist movement that rejects all war, and they can be some of the really worst in terms of not understanding. It was sort of almost a sense of willful lack of education about basic historical and geopolitical facts. I've had arguments with these far left feminists saying things like, well, the only reason Russia bombs apartment buildings is because the Ukrainian military puts the weapons there. I mean, things like this. Yes, we've all heard it. It's hard to deal with. In my mind, and this is not original in any way, right? It's not a spectrum, it's a circle. And once you get these far left people and these extreme right people, they really meet in the middle, right? Jeremy Corbyn and Jill Stein together with some white supremacists on the same panel. I think just for like the extreme right, there's not much to be done. What I really worry about, though, is that in the many countries now, there's not a left-wing party for people, particularly young people, to vote for. And so if this extreme left hijacks kind of the only functioning left-wing party, then we have a really critical problem. In the United States, I think, for example, has a very clear and supportive position on Ukraine, even if all his followers don't necessarily. He's been very good at kind of seeing this problem and putting out statement after statement to show that he is 100% for supporting Ukraine. I think in Germany is where I see the most potential for a long-term and very negative impact from these kind of far left. And some of these far left, like this new party, the Sarah Vaughan, sorry, I was getting it wrong, BSW party, they combine left-wing positions with extreme kind of right anti-migration positions. So is that a right party or a left party? I'm not sure, but it's definitely down here, where the two meet.
All right, I will read aloud two questions we've got from the Google Forms, and that we have the last question from Bari. And actually, I would like
We work hard in Ukraine, right? Yeah.
Actually, I will some from the bottom one. You don't see which one is the
Nope.
bottom. Anyway, because that's what I was to ask you. In your opinion, is it possible for the European Union to limit the rise of the authoritarian regimes on the continent? And I actually believe that it's within the competence of the Commission, if so to speak.
Great question. So we had, unfortunately, as Orban was concentrating power in Hungary, remember he was elected in 2010. This is a long time ago, and he had a strategy to concentrate power in Hungary, and the EU didn't pay attention. And one of the reasons it didn't pay attention is that the European People's Party, led by this fellow Manfred Weber, wanted to keep Fidesz in the EPP so that the EPP would continue to be the largest party and just let Orban do whatever he wanted at home. Caught up to them when, this became a kind of full-blown Trojan for Kremlin policies. But I don't think Weber has ever admitted what a mistake this was.
Yes, but actually, I remember when Hungary was in the European Council. It was the beginning of 2011, and they introduced the new constitution in Hungary, which severely limited the media in Hungary, and no one paid attention.
No one paid attention. Yeah.
And Orban said that, please, EU, stay away from our affairs. We don't need you here, but we want to deal with our domestic issues on our own and just have a look at what it brought us.
So the EU, but then the EU did learn. And so when Poland came along, the Law and Justice government, they were much quicker to impose financial sanctions where possible. The Commission can only act when rules of the internal market are being violated. And of course, the internal market key is vast, as Ukraine is finding out, and important, I would say. So there's more and more leverage points, right? Where you can, and also the rule of law mechanism. Article 7, though, remains very difficult because Article 7 requires unanimity, minus the country that's being suspended. Now, I'm not suggesting Article 7 be used to expel a country, but you could, in theory, suspend them. But you would have to get the votes of all of the other members, and we're not in that. It's very hard to see a situation where that will happen. But I see already, for example, the new government in the Czech Republic, which is a backsliding government, but they are more constrained by the EU.
And Babiš is not the same as he was last time.
I'm not going to engage in psychological analysis of who Babiš is.
But as for the Article 7, I heard a lot of speculations around that, if we allow to block Hungary, restrict Hungary, other small states may be afraid of it.
Yes.
Sometimes the same procedure will be applied to them. And as a result, the whole power will belong to just big states like Germany, France, etc. So this might be the reason why, for example, Slovakia, Czech Republic, they will be still against using Article 7. But hopefully with the new system government, that won't be the issue.
Yeah, but we can imagine others being against, right, as well.
Yes.
Austria, Greece.
All right. The second question. What do you think is the future of populism and the political parties using it? Are they going to disappear and lose an appeal, as for example it happened? Or are they here to stay? If they are here to stay, can democracy survive in this kind of political environment where populists are in power, including the societies with information, propaganda, and polarization?
So I think it's interesting because populism became popular in political science discussions and the literature, and then in journalism and think tanks and all of that, after 2010, because we saw this trend of these difficult figures coming, personalistic usually, right? Like Bolsonaro, Trump, Erdogan, a kind of concentration of power, and somehow this was conflated with populism. I think just about every political party that's ever run for office in the democracy has been to some extent populist. You could only imagine maybe some technocratic government. So, but we ask ourselves why this kind of surge of ethnopopulists and backsliders, and I think that three things: a playbook that's used by one, and then there's a lot of learning. And so there's a lot of learning from one ethnopopulist regime to another, not just in terms of the appeals to get elected, but also learning in terms of how to concentrate power. But there can also be learning on the other side, right? So think about South Korea. Look what they did, right? Pretty amazing. Bolsonaro, where is Bolsonaro right now? He's in jail. And so is the South Korean president who tried to, basically do a coup. So we can also have learning about how to handle, how to take care of incumbent politicians who try to break liberal democratic institutions. But populism, is here to stay. We just have to think about our varieties of populism and support those populists who have the inclusive view of the people. Think about it as the hug theory of politics, just like everyone's in. And it's not about excluding particular groups of people.
Perfect. Last question from Nazari, and then Sergey has something to add, I believe.
Thank you. Returning back to the discussion of populism with politics, as Sophia brought. In my bachelor's degree thesis, I was writing about the political parties in Bulgaria, and I argued how to differentiate, because Bulgarian politics are quite populistic, but how to differentiate, establishment parties from populist parties. And I wrote that populist parties are often Iceland from the other ones. The second one is that they don't have a program. They don't really have a manifesto, and even if they have a manifesto, it's just nonsense, and they don't really do anything. It's just promise to do something, but very abstract.
So it's
And
240 pages of piece of work.
yes, the third one, as I wrote there, is that they could at any point switch their foreign policy preparations. And it's not going to really change the position of their voters on whether or not to vote for them. So my question is, how would you recommend to research political parties that are personalistic? Because they, well, in case of Bulgaria especially, they kind of rely on the person of the leader, and if the leader changes or dies, then they might just start voting for them. And the second one is when we are talking about populist parties in the sense of foreign policy, how can we better see whether or not this idea of them being ready to switch their political preferentials being truthful? I may need to rephrase if you need.
Well, I'll start by saying, there's a new kind of strand of the populism literature, which I think is really interesting. Part of it is by my colleague Caitlin Andrews Lee, that looks at charismatic leaders, right? And so looks at to what extent are these leaders that we're attributing their success to populism, but what is the role of their personal charisma, and how do we study charisma? But one of the things she argues is that these charismatic leaders will often appoint a kind of successor, who is more of a disciple than a next charismatic leader. It's very hard to kind of study this role of charisma in politics and how that then kind of organizes people's support. It certainly plays a role, right? There are people who, if you ask them about policy issues, that they know that Trump disagrees with them on these policy issues, but they still love him. It's a kind of personalistic attachment. I can't think of any Bulgarian politicians that are so charismatic, but I'm not an expert on Borisov, maybe, I guess.
Boyko Borisov.
Yeah, Boyko Borisov. But Boyko Borisov was also very careful. He was always pro EU. He was very bland, right? He tried not to create any problems on the international stage. What's more interesting, first of all, I can't imagine him as charismatic or Trump, but each to their own. But he really went far on the international stage, in part because he wanted resources from Russia and elsewhere, but in part he wanted to be known as this figure that was opposing liberal democracy. I expect that we will see fewer of those figures now. I mean, just seeing how Babiš and Fico and even Radev in Bulgaria, newly elected, are behaving, none of them strike me as wanting to be this lightning rod. And that's good, because the EU itself can work with these characters when they're just trying to get some payoffs. When they have a more principled, well, that's not the right word, when they have a more kind of dogmatic ideological stand as Orban did, it was more difficult to buy him off. Now, in terms of domestic politics in Bulgaria, I don't know enough about the country. There are so many amazing scholars of Bulgarian politics that I listen to, but it does strike me that there is a problem that when they have elected pro-European center kind of parties, they haven't been able to deliver, and that kind of explains Radev's and others' victory. It's very hard to deliver on that kind of domestic reform that voters want.
What would you recommend in looking at the politicians that are populists? Because again, they can say a lot and write even little, but when you research them.
What would I recommend looking at?
In the populists, yes.
I recommend going there and talking to the everyone. Yeah. But in terms of what I recommend for Bulgaria and Romania, well, for Bulgaria in particular, I recommend that all those brilliant Bulgarians, once they retire from their jobs in the West, go, or wherever they are, go home to Bulgaria and start some new parties.
All right. And so thank you for this.
When we are following the developments in Central and Eastern Europe in a broad sense, including Bulgaria, Moldova, and Romania, we notice a few simultaneous trends in responding to the praise of populists. The first case solution of the mainstream parties is incorporating populism into the coalitions. The case of Czech Republic, the high probability of the case in Poland after the next elections, the next simultaneously. Slovaks, of course, with the semester in a coalition already. But there is already a simultaneous trend, which is creating the parties which are so populist that satisfy everybody, composed of the mainstream politicians. That's the case of Biden. That's the case of PISA. What is the problem here from my perspective in terms of the EU? If you rely on the coalition, then you at least know how to sell the European decisions to your coalition members. But if you try to satisfy everybody, it means that each decision you make at the European level, you simply cannot sell in your country because you have to appeal to too many groups. Because if Biden is Western, then he loses the votes of those who are pro-Russian. If he's pro-Russian, he loses the vote. So he will be hesitant to take any decisions. That will create a problem for the EU because the negotiations at the European table, the politicians from all the majorities even won't be able to promise anything, so they cannot sell it to their domestic politicians. Even my son in Moldova, it's a very vague manifesto of Ukrainian solidarity. They won one majority, but now they have to produce something appealing to everyone. So how to fix this problem?
This is a problem for many EU states, right? That any decision to move European integration forward in a demonstrable way is probably not going to be popular at home, right? There are very few, maybe Denmark, maybe not, publics that are sort of asking for deeper integration. They may not be against it if they knew the details, but just that as a policy position, it's hardly ever a winning position domestically. And things are done very quietly, right? Like in response to the financial crisis, we have banking union, we have greater regulation of banks and so forth in the EU, but it's quite quiet, right? This is not anything that people come home and brag about. So I think my answer to your question would be this has been the case, always has been the case. Even in moments where you think like France that always wants more foreign policy should be pushing for it, it's actually not pushing very much because it's not so popular domestically. But I think this is a little bit part of the magic of how European integration continues to deepen, that most governments can hide behind the collective when it comes, as long as they're centrist, they don't need to really say much that they were part of these decisions. And they can still, I think centrist politicians, this is the EU's greatest problem, right? Is that when something goes well, you never say, oh, the EU did this wonderful thing. You always say, oh, we did this wonderful thing, right? I've never heard a Czech politician, well, I have heard a few, but the Czech economy is doing extremely well, but few Czech politicians would linger on the reason for this being the EU. Same with Poland, right? They don't really talk about the fact that the Polish economic miracle is because of the EU. What if something goes wrong? Always the EU's fault. Every unwanted migrant, every economic problem is the EU's fault. So this is standard operating procedure. But I understand what you're saying, Sergey, because in this moment where we need innovation, and it would be really good to move quickly to sort of take advantage of these two shocks I talked about, to put in place real competencies in defense and security. This constant shifting tapestry of domestic politics and veto players and hesitancy, it is really hurting, slowing the process almost to a standstill. Which is where, I'll make a plug for my article with Nadia Koval, both the one we published, but one we're working on now. It's actually impressive to what extent the European Commission as supranational entrepreneurs have been able to push forward. Intergovernmentalists and European integration theory thought they won the day, but I think today the neo-functionalists are having kind of resurgence because we see all this hesitancy, and yet we see progress as the Commission keeps pushing it forward. And as Russia keeps making it very clear how threatening it is, right? So this insanity on the part of Moscow, I think, is helping too.
Okay, I guess we covered all the questions. So
And speaking of insanity, we made it through without an air raid alert, which
that's
great.
pretty good.
It's pretty good.
Thank you to everyone who came here today. Thank you for all the online participants for the time that you found, that you decided to attend our events, not the events in the book arsenal, for example. But thank you very much once again for your insights, for your presentations, for the fact that you covered a lot of questions today. I actually couldn't even count how many questions we asked you, but thank you very much. And that's all for today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.